인클루시브 코리아 2021 제4세션 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 이번 세션은 한반도 평화 프로세스
will cover peace process on the Korean Peninsula and the peacekeeping government. The first presenter will be from the Korea Institute for National Reunification research fellow Kim Sang-gi. He will speak under the topic of responding to North Korea's nuclear crisis and the maintenance of peace on the Korean Peninsula.
Good afternoon. As have been introduced, I am Kim Sang-gi of the Korea Institute for National Unification. The topic is the Moon Jae-in administration's 4-year journey. And within this journey, I would like to speak under the topic of the efforts made for peace on the Korean Peninsula. What are some of the programs, initiatives, and policies that have been placed? And I will also take a look at the US-DPRK relations and the inter-Korean relations. Then I would like to take a look at the recent situations of the inter-Korean relations and the US-DPRK relations, as well as the tasks for the future. Here you see the table of contents. We started the peace process in 2018, but let's take a look at the situation of 2017. Then let's take a look at how we were able to transform the situation into a situation of dialogue. Then let's take a look at the inter-Korean summits as well as the US-DPRK summits. And then we will take a look at the military agreement. Recently, we have had more difficult situations between the two Koreas, so let's take a look at the current inter-Korean relations and the US-DPRK relations, and also take a look at what we need to do in order to move the inter-Korean relations further in the future. First of all, in 2017, the year that the Moon Jae-in administration took office was a very different times compared to the current situation. The conflict between the US and DPRK was escalating at that time. There are a few keywords at that time. North Korea continued to strengthen their nuclear power, and they tested strategic weapons. They tested the IRBM on several occasions. They also tested Hwasong 15 and 14, which are ICBM missiles. They conducted the 6th nuclear test in September. Through this process, on November 29th of 2017, North Korea goes to declare that they have completed their nuclear program. And in response, at that time in 2017, the US implements several sanctions on North Korea through the Security Council, continuing to pressure North Korea. Not only did the US use sanctions, but they actually reviewed the option of using military forces. And so that option was reviewed by the Trump administration in 2017. And through this process, there was fear that there could be another war on the Korean Peninsula. Through this process, the role of the Moon Jae-in administration was very important. At that time, in May of 2017, the Moon Jae-in administration took office, and they continued to send a message of peace to North Korea. The Pyeongchang Winter Olympics was to be held in February the next year, and they continued to send a message to North Korea that with the participation of North Korea, they wish to create a Peace Olympics. And in June of 2017, there was the Taekwondo World Competition, and an invitation was extended to North Korea. There was the Berlin Declaration and the UN General Assembly, and on all of these occasions, the Moon Jae-in administration continued to extend their invitation to North Korea to participate in the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics. And what was an important turning point was that on December 19th of 2017, President Moon Jae-in has an interview with the NBC, and he announces his promise to postpone the joint military exercises. And following that interview on January 1st of 2018, Chairman Kim Jong-un of North Korea announces his intentions to participate North Korea at the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics. And the high-level talks between the two Koreas happens on January 9th, and we do have the participation of North Korean athletes and supporters at the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics. So Korea plays a leading role in improving the inter-Korean relations. And what is important about the improvement of the inter-Korean relations was that it actually translated into facilitating the US-DPRK talks. We had a series of envoys. We had an envoy to North Korea on March 5th. And upon meeting Chairman Kim Jong-un, there was a promise for the Inter-Korean Summit in April, and North Korea also shows their determination for denuclearization against the backdrop of normalization of ties with the U.S. And then in March, again, the special envoy of Moon Jae-in visits the U.S., and that is when we see the announcement of the historic US-DPRK summit. On April 27th, there was the Inter-Korean Summit, and there was the Panmunjom Declaration, which includes the content of making efforts to improve the inter-Korean relations and also reduce military tension, and also to conduct efforts for denuclearization and establishment of a peace regime. The US-DPRK relations was hostile for quite a long time, and so even if the plans for a summit was announced on March 8th, the process was not easy. The relations soured in April, and so that actually led to President Trump canceling the plans for a summit. And so on May 26th, the Inter-Korean Summit happens again, and thanks to this summit, we reignite the flame for the US-DPRK summit, which leads to the June 12th US-DPRK summit, which was a first ever in history, and that leads to the Singapore joint statement. The content of this joint statement is also very important, establishing a new US-DPRK relations, establishing a peace regime on the Korean Peninsula, denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula was all promised within the Singapore joint statement. In 2017, we were talking about another war on the Korean Peninsula, but in 2018, with the Pyeongchang Olympics, we were able to kickstart a peace process, and so it was indeed a very dramatic process. And what we need to take note of is the proactive role played by Korea by improving the inter-Korean relations. That actually led the way to facilitate
facilitate the US-DPRK relations. And this is something that we need to make sure that we take note of, even in the current situation. As a result, the nuclear negotiations between the US and DPRK actually was in a standstill for 6 years, and so before the spring of 2018, we did not have any substantial dialogue. But thanks to the proactive role played by Korea, as well as the improved inter-Korean relations, we were able to go back to dialogue, which had been in a stalemate since 2006. And we were able to change the system from a military tension-based system to a dialogue-based system, and this is what we need to take note of in the current situation. There's another important achievement. This is the Comprehensive Military Agreement. This was signed in September of 2018 as an auxiliary to the Pyongyang Joint Statement. The 2018 Pyongyang Joint Statement is a follow-up to the Panmunjom Statement, so it is adding the details to execute the Panmunjom Statement. We will stop the military hostile relations. We will resume the Inter-Korean Military Committee, and we will also conduct projects to develop the two Koreas, mainly the Kaesong Industrial Complex and the Kumgangsan Tourism Complex. And we also agreed on the dismantlement of the Dongchangli engine test platform and the missile launch platform, as well as permanent dismantlement of the Yangbyon nuclear facility. In the military area, they agreed on establishing a peaceful region between the two Koreas. Of course, all of the promises were not executed, but there were important executions. For example, the meeting of the separated families in 2018. Of course, we did see the explosion of the liaison office recently, but the liaison office was opened in 2018. The de-armament of JSA in 2018, the removal of the GP station, as well as the start of the construction to connect the railway and the roads. And so you can see that arms control was started in 2018. And thanks to the military agreement in September of 2018, that has actually supported the maintenance of peace on the Korean Peninsula without the escalation of military tension. And so those were outstanding achievements that are notable. Then we go to the recent situations. Well, as I mentioned before, ever since the Hanoi summit, despite the achievements up to the Hanoi summit, we have seen that the peace process on the Korean Peninsula has been in a stalemate. Of course, there were some opportunities for dialogue along the way, and there were exchanges of letters, but they did not lead to advancements. Ever since the launch of the Biden administration, in February and March of 2021, there were attempts to speak to North Korea, but North Korea did not respond. The U.S. recently announced their review of their North Korean policies, but North Korea has not responded yet. Let's take a look at the position of North Korea. Well, in January of 2021, at the 8th People's Assembly, they have announced that concerning South Korea, they are asking that we stop the joint military exercises with the USFK and that we stop the import of high-tech armament And through the Kim Yo-jong statement, they have announced that it will be difficult to resume inter-Korean dialogue. Concerning the U.S., they are asking that the U.S. eliminates their hostile policy towards North Korea, and this is a consistent position of North Korea ever since the Hanoi summit in 2019. Let's take a look at Biden's North Korean policy. Well, currently, the Biden administration, unlike the past administrations, are looking for gradual denuclearization. They will be using military diplomatic pressure and also emphasizing the need for consulting with allies, and they were continuing to prioritize the arms control of their nuclear capabilities. And on April 30th of 2021, they announced their review of North Korean policies. And what they mentioned is that they will not try to have a package deal like Trump. They will no longer use strategic patience like Obama, but there will be a new approach. And if we take a look at the actual contents, they said they will base their approach on the Singapore joint statement. The goal is full denuclearization, but they are willing to move step by step. That really is the plan by the Biden administration for the North Korean nuclear program. This is quite meaningful. Ever since the Hanoi summit of 2019, we can see that a part of their agenda was partial denuclearization in exchange for partial removal of sanctions. And we can see that maybe the Biden administration will pick up from where they were left off at the Hanoi summit. There was the Inter-Korean Summit on May 21st of 2021, and there was the summit between the U.S. and Korea on May 21st of 2021, and they have agreed that they will be using dialogue to solve the North Korean issue. So, in a nutshell, denuclearization will happen step by step, and they will also base all of their approaches on existing agreements between the two Koreas and between the U.S. and DPRK. But we have yet to see resumed dialogue, and so I think we need more measures to bring North Korea back to the table. But we see that there are currently uncertainties as to whether negotiations and dialogues will be resumed. Let's take a look at some future tasks ahead. These are some considerations to be made. At the January 8th People's Assembly, North Korea announced their position for South Korea and the U.S., and it seems that their position is not likely to change. In June, they actually had an assembly of the Central Party, and they actually mentioned that they will prepare for both dialogue and confrontation. Some people actually gave a positive spin on the statement, and Kim Yo-jong mentioned that she does not think we should give it a positive spin. And we see the escalation of competition between the U.S. and China, which is actually facilitating cooperation between China and DPRK. This actually will strengthen the leverage of North Korea when they are negotiating with the U.S. And so, in solving the Korean Peninsula issues, we must focus our attention on the U.S.-China relations as well. And if we take a look into the future, next month is August, and whether we will continue with the joint exercise in August and whether North Korea will respond to these exercises will be very important in the inter-Korean relations for the future. At this current point in time,
What do we need to focus on? Well, first of all, because we are at a stalemate, we need to take a look at how we can resume dialogue and improve relations. And how are we going to set the conditions to enable the resumption of dialogue? That is the most important task at hand. How can we go back to the dialogue that we wish to pursue? And there are three things that I would like to suggest. First, we need to either postpone or cancel the August joint exercises. As I mentioned before, as North Korea has mentioned their position at the 8th People's Assembly, they will not easily change their position. And the North Koreans are saying that their precondition to dialogue is the canceling of the joint exercise between the U.S. and Korea. And they continue to ask that these exercises be canceled as a prerequisite for inter-Korean dialogue. And so in order to resume dialogue for North Korea, we need to either postpone or cancel the August joint exercise. That is one suggestion that I would like to make. The second is the exemption of sanctions on the inter-Korean cooperation for the economic sector. So the Biden administration has mentioned that it fully supports the Panmunjom Declaration at the May U.S. Korea summit. And so that could be an important pillar in resuming the inter-Korean exchanges. And we also need to think about humanitarian aid and cooperation for North Korea. This brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you. Thank you very much. That was Dr. Kim Sang-gi of the Korea Institute for National Unification on responding to North Korea's nuclear crisis and maintenance of peace on the Korean Peninsula.
Let's go on to the second presentation, which will be given by Professor Kim Young-jun of the National Security College of the Korea National Defense University. The presentation is on strengthening of the defense power realization of responsible defense. Please greet him with a big hand. Yes, good afternoon. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me. I would like to thank President Go Yu-hwan of the Korea Institute for National Unification and also all other members of the session for inviting me and having me join you. So today I would like to talk about the discourse about strengthening national defense. There has been concern that the dual track of pursuing national defense strengthening and also the other efforts to promote peace might clash. But actually, we are seeing good response and good results, actually. I'm not saying that the Moon Jae-in administration has done everything well, but I think that the situation is better than many people had expected. So I would like to talk about that and also the direction for going forward. So the presentation is in 4 parts. First of all, I'll talk about how we were able to secure national defense budget to strengthen the military strength by adopting state-of-the-art weapon systems and the efforts for OPCON transfer based on a strong Korea-US alliance, and also the change towards autonomous and accountable military culture, and also the military support for peace on the Korean Peninsula. So in the news, I understand that there are some concerning news that we have been hearing about. For example, we have made great efforts for the past 4 years to promote peace, but it seems like there are a number of problems that have accumulated over the years and are exposing themselves. But I think that this current situation is actually an opportunity for Korea. And I would like to mention about how efforts have been made to reform the military, and I think that there are some parts that are connected to the previous presentation and the next presentation as well. So I have a lot of photos that I would like to share with you, and my presentation content is actually quite concise. But you can see that because of the COVID-19 situation, we held the military meetings through online channels. In 2020, we were able to secure a national defense budget of 50 trillion won. This is an increase compared to the 40.3 trillion won in 2017. Compared to the GDP, this is less than 3%. However, compared to the Lee Myung-bak and Park Geun-hye administration, unlike the prejudice that we had, the national military and defense budget was not increased that much. I understand that there is a consensus among the people that we need self-defense achieved through our military. We need to have the self-capability to defend our nation. And so under the Moon Jae-in administration, we have been able to secure a national defense budget of 50 trillion won, and continuous efforts have been made for self-defense and the military strength that can make this possible. And so based on this, we have been able to adopt state-of-the-art technology to strengthen our military and national defense. So we are pursuing peace on the Korean Peninsula, but at the same time, we are pursuing strengthening of national defense. Why are we going in these two different directions? But actually, the two can go together, because national defense is not only targeting North Korea. So I would like to mention that, first of all. And the highlight is the conclusion, the end of the Korea-US military guideline. I think that not many people had expected this, and there are not many officials within the government that had expected that the Korea-US missile guidelines would come to an end. And so Mr. Kim Hyun-jong and a number of officials actually made efforts to persuade the United States, based on our rationale, to end the missile guidelines. And I think that this is a signal that shows the level of trust between Korea and US as an alliance. So I think that if the United States was concerned about the missile development direction that Korea will take once the missile guidelines were concluded, but actually we were able to persuade the U.S., and it also shows at the conclusion, the end of the guidelines shows the trust that the U.S. has in Korea. And also cooperation between the U.S. and Korea in the cyberspace and also outer space and missile area, I think is possible. And there has been many different developments and advancements in terms of the state-of-the-art weapons. We have been able to develop our own weapons. For example, with the domestic technology, we were able to build a submarine, and so Korea is one of the fifth major submarine exporting countries. And on the left, you see the photo of the president making a visit commemorating the 50th anniversary of the ADD. And some people joke that the only country that can sell the ships to the UK, which is very proud of its naval power, is Korea. So this shows the strength of our naval military power. Also, with our technology, we were able to develop a sonic aircraft, KF-21. This started with the Kim Dae-jung administration, and the technology has continuously been pursued and developed, and so we were able to develop this technology, and we have succeeded. And so on April 9th, 2021, we had publicly announced the aircraft. As you know, there are not many countries that can develop these jets, and there are only 8 countries that have this capability. So Korea is among the proud 8 nations. I'm sure that you all know this, but once again, I would like to emphasize this accomplishment. And next, the wartime operational command transfer based on the strong ROK-US alliance. So it is possible that the joint training can be reduced or expanded depending on the situation, but we have nevertheless a very strong alliance, and based on that, wartime operation control transfers being pursued by the two countries. So there is ongoing efforts to discuss ways to carry this out. There are a number of issues between the two countries within the alliance, but once again we were able to confirm that the alliance was elevated into a strategic alliance through the US-Korea summit. So we have a 70-year history, and I do believe that through this recent summit we were able to lay the groundwork for the next 70 years of a strong partnership. The cyber, semiconductors, space, and other areas that we can cooperate together were recognized during the Korea-US summit, and we were able to confirm the strength of the alliance. I think that pursuing peace between the two Koreas might hurt ties with the United States. That was one concern within the Korean society, but I think that this is just a misconception that Koreans seem to have. The two can go together. We could have a strong alliance with the US and pursue peace with North Korea. And I think that the two do not clash. And we were able to confirm that as we looked at the efforts and the achievements of the current administration. And also, we have been requesting cooperation with the United States, and likewise in various fields, and military field is also an area for potential cooperation. We are receiving contact and we are reviewing ways to work with the United States. But the US always have recognized Korea as a partner for its global strategy, and we have the capabilities to meet such requests. That is my judgment and view. So, we did a survey on the perceptions of the people. For example, according to Korea Research in June of 2020, we did a survey on the people's perception of the Korea-US alliance and the capability of our military. And you can see that the perception, the positive sentiment is increasing. So I think that it is meaningless to talk about the weakening of the Korea-US alliance. And I think that through this administration, we were able to even further strengthen the bilateral ties. Also, there has been a lot of efforts to improve the gender equality within the military, and I'm sure that a lot of people have children who are doing their military service. Some people have been saying, compared to the past, the military service has become actually not that harsh. There are not many military officers that make the soldiers do work late in the evening. And the soldiers can actually use the mobile phones. There has been a lot of changes. Of course, there are still room for improvement, but I would like to say that military service has become different and has changed for the better compared to the past. Of course, there was the issue of the meals provided to the military force, but I understand that currently a privatization of the meal services for the military is under review, and this will further reform and improve the military. Also, there has been past experiences that made the military look back at the gender equality and gender sensitivity culture. So there are now efforts being pursued for improving this part of the military culture. A couple of years ago, there was great controversy over whether the military men should be allowed to use mobile phones while they're doing their military duty. But now, actually, this use of mobile phones is now widespread. There has been great improvements in the lives of the people who are doing their military service. I think that going to the future, more unpleasant events will decrease in number. And also, we are currently talking about the partial implementation of professional soldier career path. instead of having all males serve their military duties in a mandatory manner. So next, strong military to support peace on the Korean Peninsula. That's another topic. The historic significance of the September 19th agreement is something that we all acknowledge. North Korea has not violated anything concerning September 19th, and the explosion of the liaison office has not been included in this agreement. So you cannot say that everything that we agreed upon and negotiated has gone back to zero. That everything was worthless, because actually there was no actual violations, and we have not experienced another Cheonan vessel incident. The UN and the Inter-Korean Joint Military Committee activities should have been promoted, but because of the liaison offices is no longer in place, this has been contracted a bit, these activities. But the North Korean side actually had called for the eradication of the posts. North Korea already does not have the GOPs, and Kim Jong-un's position is that there will be no further expansion of the traditional forces. And so I think that there is fundamental changes that we're seeing on the Korean Peninsula, and South Korea is also controlling its arms to help promote the peace on the Korean Peninsula. So in some sense, well, I've done a lot of studies and joined with the US and the UK, and those who engage in arms control actually are the hardliners. The arms control actually is something that takes place every day, not only when the situation deteriorates. And also you need to have the ability to deter the opposing forces. So arms control and non-proliferation experts actually are hardliners, and we can see them in the US and the UK. I think that there is a misconception about arms control, that arms control actually weakens military forces of Korea, but those are misconceptions and misunderstandings. And right now, as it was mentioned by Dr. Kim Sang-ki, and also I think that Dr. Go Yuan will mention this as well, the efforts for non-proliferation. But I think that we can go on to the next stage for inter-Korean exchanges and cooperation in the military field. Now, Dr. Bu and I, we engaged in a joint research with the U.S. side, and the U.S. believes that the military committee is an issue for the two Koreas. So when it comes to arms reduction, of course, when it comes to the structural arms control or operational arms control, the United States, when it comes to structural issues, well, perhaps the U.S. side might take interest, but when it comes to operational arms control, Dr. Vector or Scott Snyder believes that this is something for the two Koreas to take care of. The U.S. is very supportive of this, and also Commander Bruce is very supportive of this as well. So I think that, of course, we have to be aligned with the U.S. on the issues. And the people who have actually been here to this area knows that we are enjoying and bearing the fruits of our past efforts. We have to show everyone who are skeptical of inter-Korean relations our past efforts bearing fruit. The situation in the Panmunjom, there's a lot of seminars that are being hosted about the September 19th agreement's significance. So as long as it's not about the structural arms control, we can see that the U.S. is very supportive about the North Korean side and the South Korean side leading the way in terms of the military field
이게 분명히 국방력 약화가 아닙니다.
and operational arms control. This does not hurt our military forces or our military power. We are strengthening national defense. We are implementing new technologies. And so arms control is something that is not at odds with national defense strengthening. It's something that goes together. And once again, the arms control experts, they are hardliners within the Department of Defense in the United States. The arms control took place mainly during the Republican administration. So the hardliners, when they were in power, usually the arms control were further promoted. So there's a misunderstanding that we have to resolve among the Korean people about arms control. So I'm not saying that everything that was pursued by the Moon Jae-in administration led to good results. I'm not saying that everything is worthy of praise, but I think that accurate evaluation of the accomplishments is required and that we can indeed verify that we have seen good results. Thank you very much.
네, 고맙습니다.
Yes, thank you very much. We have just heard from Professor Kim
자,
Young-jun.
이어서 제4세션 마지막
Next, we will hear the last presentation of session 4. We would like to now invite Dr. Hong Seok-kun, a research fellow at the Korea Institute for National Unification, titled Inclusive International Cooperation, Diversification of International Diplomacy.
안녕하십니까. 통일연구원 홍석훈입니다.
Good afternoon. My name is Hong Seok-kun at the Korea Institute for National Unification. It's an honor to present at this session. I will be presenting under the title of Inclusive International Cooperation, Diversification of International Diplomacy. Of course, this is an opportunity to look back on the last 4 years and also to look forward to take a look at what tasks lie ahead. We have already heard from Dr. Kim and Dr. Kim Sang-gi and Kim Yong-jun, and we have taken a look at the peace process on the Korean Peninsula. In conducting the peace process on the Korean Peninsula, what is our goal? Why are we conducting peace process on the Korean Peninsula? What kind of diplomacy do we need? And so those are the points that I would like to cover. Of course, politically and militarily, we need to take a look at diplomacy, and we need to take a look at diplomacy from other aspects as well. But I would like to take an inclusive perspective. We can see that there is a diversification of international diplomacy and the position of Korea. And so I would like to mainly talk about the issue of smart power with the neighboring countries and how we have created a favorable international environment through balanced diplomacy. And I would also like to take a look at the efforts made for a sustainable peace process on the Korean Peninsula. Of course, ever since the Hanoi summit, we have not had any dialogue with North Korea. And because of COVID-19, we have not been able to have dialogue with North Korea. But what I would like to mention through my presentation is the direction for our diplomacy. Diplomatic strategies are a global public goods. So I think it's time we talk about international public goods. So what is the diplomatic strategy that we will have for the whole world, including North Korea? When we think about international diplomacy, everyone talks about status. And depending on your status, your diplomacy should change. Our two previous presenters also talked about this issue, and it is quite redundant. But due to COVID-19, we see that there is a threat to liberalism. And we also see the shift of power from the west to the east. And is the global governance still relevant? Will we see a change in the international order? Well, many people in the academia talked about these issues. But everyone agrees that we are still in an era of strategic competition. Along with this, from our perspective, we are in a dilemma of making strategic choices. Especially when the strategic conflicts become escalated, we feel pressure to make a choice. And as you're well aware,
With the Biden administration taking office, there is a strengthening of global governance amongst like-minded nations, especially those pursuing democracy. And there are issues related to human rights. China is not taking a step back, and there is the conflict between Quad and the trilateral alliance between Korea, Japan, and the US against China's one road, one belt policy. Well, we have had a lot of help ever since the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics. We have had very proactive participation in various summits, and through inter-Korean summits, we have been able to open the way for diplomacy with North Korea. But ever since the Hanoi summit and COVID-19, we have not been able to continue our diplomacy with North Korea. But even so, what I would like to mention is that in the past, we have tried to keep peace by going back and forth between the two Koreas and the US, but this time around, we were in the driver's seat. That is very important. Well, at the 8th People's Assembly, there were very strong statements made. Of course, they're trying to become self-sufficient and they're trying to stand on their own 2 feet. And the North Korean authorities, they are admitting to the failure of their economic strategies. And so we will have to see at what will happen in North Korea. We also need to take a look at non-traditional security issues. Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we now have a renewed understanding of security. There are non-traditional security issues and also the necessity for cooperation in the health sector as well. When we take a look at national power, we take a look at military power, economic power, and we also take a look at the power of civic societies and the power of culture as well. Even if COVID-19 continues to aggravate the international order, we will continue to focus on various powers possessed by different individual nations. And these issues will continue to be in the limelight. We can also see a diversification of the actors of diplomacy. We have a stronger participation of civic society, and we are seeing the introduction of the global public goods. So what can the government do? How can they lead the civic society? This global governance system is becoming more important than ever before. The government actors and the non-government actors must act together in order to expand diplomacy through catalytic diplomacy, para-diplomacy, and multi-track diplomacy. And this is the same for Korea as well. Korea should be proactive in participating in a wider variety of diplomacy. Well, the Ministry of Diplomatic Affairs and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs continues to talk about the strategy as a middle-income country, but we have to continue to make sure that the traditional aspects of diplomacy are still important, such as peace building. And along these lines, the peace process on the Korean Peninsula must be discussed. Through the peace process, we need to make sure that not only do we pursue diplomacy, but create a global agenda as a leader. We should also take a look at the diplomatic strategies as a middle-income country, and so we need to make sure that our core agenda is focused on social power. We need to continue to emphasize social power. Peace, sustainable growth are common agendas, universal values that we are all striving for. In terms of the inter-Korean relations, in the past we were focused on the uniqueness of the two Koreas, but we now need to approach the inter-Korean relations from a universal value perspective. Peace building in the 21st century, in the end, will facilitate the improvement of the standard of living in Korea. And that is why we are talking talking about smart power. Ever since we started to talk about soft power, more and more people start to talk about power, smart power. And so that is why we need to have public diplomacy, diplomacy based on politics, and diplomacy based on economics. So various types of diplomacies should be expanded. We have conducted efforts to have a balanced diplomacy, and as you're well aware, peaceful coexistence is our slogan for the peace regime in Northeast Asia. We also have the 3P policies and the new Northern policy, and all of these new policies will be utilized for peace building on the Korean Peninsula and in the vicinity. We have exchanges with North Korea. We also have cultural exchanges within the region. And given the political situation and the nuclear issue of North Korea and the sanctions against North Korea, these efforts were not very active. But with a future-oriented view, I don't think we can stand still. What we need to do is to utilize our status and make sure that we are in the driver's seat in discovering new agenda items and moving forward. We need to think about using diplomacy to create a life community. Well, currently the inter-Korean relations have soured due to COVID-19. International cooperation is quite difficult, and so it's very difficult to pursue these goals, but this is a direction that we need to go in. The May 2021 U.S.-Korea summit showed that the momentum still exists for peace process on the Korean Peninsula. Of course, there are many obstacles, but that doesn't mean that we just need to wait and see. But we already took a look at the Korea-U.S. summit and its meeting through the other presentations, so I will go on. In order to make sure that we have a sustainable peace process on the Korean Peninsula, we need to make sure that we take into account the SDGs adopted by the UN and the member states. The triple axis cooperation model is a model that is in line with SDG. So the triple nexus model is related to the triangle cooperation model, which includes humanitarian aid and support. I believe that all of these efforts must go together in order to create a sustainable peace process on the Korean Peninsula. Of course, we will need dialogue and cooperation between the government, but we also need to make sure that economic cooperation, social exchanges, and humanitarian aid must go hand in hand. So by establishing cooperation, we need to induce North Korea to open and reform itself, and this could be used as motivation for the peace process on the Korean Peninsula. Triple nexus has already been discussed within the international community, and I believe that triple nexus should be applied to North Korea. Through inclusive international cooperation, I believe that this is the direction that we need to move in, and this is the direction that we are moving in. Concerning SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, the international society has already adopted SDGs through the UN as a part of its efforts to create global public goods. And as you're well aware, last month through VNR, the North Korean authorities also submitted their SDG report, mentioning that they will actively respond to improving the quality of life for its citizens by 2030. Of course, currently the inter-Korean relations have soured. We are not able to talk to North Korea, but you can see that concerning SDGs, North Korea is still very active. Concerning the SDGs and triple nexus, I think if the government authorities would utilize these axes, then it could be utilized for international cooperation and also inter-Korean cooperation, because North Korea is also participating in SDG efforts. So I believe that there is room for leveraging SDGs and triple nexus. Of course, there could be various dialogue for the triple nexus model between the two Koreas, but first of all, the governance structure is very important. We need to make sure that we expand the dialogue to various universal items on the agenda, which then can bring us into the triple nexus. And so this is the hope that I have for the inter-Korean dialogue. Of course, if we are not able to solve the political issue, improving inter-Korean relations is very difficult, but nevertheless, for the expansion of global public goods, we need to actively participate. So we always talked about how we need to have balanced diplomacy, and so when we have all of these items in the bucket together comprehensively, then we can move forward. So in order to find universal items for our smart diplomacy, we need to make sure that we remind ourselves of the status that we have in the international community. And through cooperation in diplomacy, we are able to raise our prestige in the international stage and also pursue universal value around the world. And so we need to have leadership in establishing these agendas. Of course, we also need to think about national interests. But for diplomacy, each country strives for their national interests, but at the same time, we need to think about our universal agenda of striving for global public goods. And so we need to have two strategies at the same time. We also need to look at smart diplomacy strategies. We have K-culture that is quite popular, but we need to make sure that we can expand this into universal value, utilizing our knowledge and technology. And we believe that all of these efforts could be leveraged to establish a sustainable peace process on the Korean Peninsula through various diplomacy efforts and policies. Through the VNR, North Korea has talked about their energy in agriculture and light industries, and they said they will make an investment in those areas. And they will also work on micro-dust, environmental issues, the natural environment, and they have mentioned that they need international support to pursue these goals. And so we need to actually think about the needs of North Korea, and this will indeed move the inter-Korean relations forward. North Korea is a closed country, but as they are participating in the SDG efforts as well as establishing of peace, I believe that North Korea will participate in cooperation with South Korea concerning these items. I know that political and military items on the agenda are very important as well. I'm not saying that agenda is not important, but I believe that when I listen to the younger generation, they are willing to move forward according to changes in the environment. And I believe that now is a time to renew our inter-Korean relations. I tried to keep my presentation short, and through the discussion portion, I hope to learn much more from our panelists. Thank you very much.
네, 고맙습니다.
Yes, thank you very much. We have just heard from Dr. Hong Seok-kwon. And now let us go into the panel discussion. For this panel discussion, I would like to invite the three speakers and our moderator, who is the president of the Korea Institute for National Unification, Dr. Ko Yu-hwan, and also our discussants, Dr. Lee Soo-hyung, Professor Shin Seung-ho, Dr. Poo Hyung-wook, and Professor Chung Jae-kwan of Korea University, and also Dr. Scott Snyder sent us a video recording of his remarks. He is with the Council on Foreign Relations. Let me first introduce our moderator, President Ko Yu-hwan. He is currently the chair of the Korean Peninsula Subcommittee of the Policy Advisory Committee of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the current chair of the Planning and Coordination Committee of the National Unification Advisory Council. He served as a member of the Peace and Prosperity Subcommittee of the Presidential Commission on Policy Planning and the chair to President Ko Yu-hwan.
네, 여러분들
Yes,
안녕하십니까?
good afternoon, everyone.
세션
I am the moderator of session 4
평화를 유지한
on the topic of peace process in the Korean Peninsula and the peacekeeping
세
government.
분의
So we have heard 3 presentations in relation with this topic, and
용어가
the phrase inclusive policy, I think, was first used and introduced
태우 정부 때 88년 77 선언을
In 1988, during the Notae administration, when the July 7th declaration was made, at that time North Korea was viewed for the first time as a partner for reconciliation. And after that, for the sunshine policy of the Kim Il-jung administration, we heard about the reconciliation policy, and this was called as inclusive policy towards North Korea. So inclusivity, this is a large theme for today. We're talking about inclusion once again. The origin of this actually comes from, in some sense, the policy towards North Korea. And since then, with the inauguration of the Moon Jae-in administration, I think that first of all, we talked about an inclusive society as a part of social policies. So inclusion became a major concept for the discourse for social policies, but now it has been expanded to be included as a policy goal for creating an inclusive nation. Sustainable, inclusive nation is what we aspire to develop, and we are in that process of building that kind of a nation. Now, as a scholar studying North Korean affairs, I was able to see the Central Party's 8th meeting, which was held at the end of June. And I read the related document and saw North Korea using the wording inclusive policy. So this actually is a wording that I had not seen before. I could see North Korea using the same wording, inclusive policy. Most recently, if we look at the inter-Korean relations, we can see that the COVID-19 pandemic has led us to think about a life community. And in some sense, the members living on the Korean Peninsula are part of this life community. We have to seek inclusion as members of the same community. And today, during this session, we are talking about the military sector. In the past, we had a very traditional concept for security. And now, however, in this new era where we are all hit by the COVID-19 pandemic, it's very difficult to distinguish the enemy and the friendly forces. And also from a human security perspective, we are approaching our challenges. And so, having said that, the discourse surrounding inclusion, I think, is actually something that receives priority in this era. So before we go into the panel discussion, I would like to introduce to you some of the views by the people that was carried out through an event to collect the opinions of the people. So we had raised some questions to the citizens of Korea, and I would actually like to introduce the questions and the response from the citizens as we proceed with the discussion. So there were some people who had shared their opinions and comments. For example, there were those who had called for consistency in the policies, that the policies towards North Korea and the Korean Peninsula peace process should be consistently pursued. And also there were some proposals and recommendations, for example, the Kumgang Mountain Tourism Project and cooperation with North Korea for vaccination was suggested and proposed. I think that these are good ideas. And also there was an opinion about the Kaesong Industrial Complex. There is a Kaesong Industrial Complex Management Committee after the close down of the Kaesong Industrial Complex. Still, we have the management committee in place. And I think that to promote inter-Korean relations that befit the current era. And I think that we need this kind of a committee or an organization that can promote inter-Korean relations and exchanges. So I think that the suggestion is in line with that. And also, the unification environment is changing because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So having that into consideration, there were questions about what should be the new efforts in this new unification environment. And also, along with the efforts to improve North Korea and U.S. ties, what are some of the inter-Korean projects that can be pursued? And also, the issue of improving relations in a mutually beneficial manner when it comes to bilateral ties with the U.S. and Korea. And also, the policy-related questions and recommendations were raised. And also, the Korean Peninsula peace process. Well, we talk a lot about this process, but as we persist this, then what is the specific unification policy? That was another question that was raised. So also, then what are the tasks for the incoming government? That was another question. And I think that our discussants, please keep these questions in mind as you prepare your remarks. So, our presenters gave their presentations within their given time. We have about 55 minutes remaining. So I think that we should first invite Dr. Scott Snyder, a senior fellow for Korea Studies from the Council on Foreign Relations. He sent a video to deliver his remarks, and after listening to that, why don't we have each person speak for about 7 to 8 minutes?
We will now turn to Scott Snyder for his remarks.
Thank you for the invitation to participate virtually in today's conference commemorating the first 4 years of the Moon administration and to comment on the paper by Dr. Sang Kim, which evaluates the Moon administration's policies toward North Korea and provides recommendations on remaining tasks to be accomplished by the end of the Moon administration. The paper asserts that a major accomplishment of the Moon administration involves the actions Moon took to reopen a pathway to peaceful denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. The pathway appears to have been closed at the time Moon became president by diametrically opposed positions between the US and North Korea on the legitimacy of North Korea's nuclear development, and by rising tensions in 2017 resulting from North Korean missile testing and President Trump's rhetorical escalation in response. I agree with Dr. Kim that President Moon's actions intended to avert US-North Korean conflict were a major accomplishment of his administration, and that Moon deserves credit for his intermediary role and for his successful efforts to reopen US-North Korea diplomacy. But I disagree on the centrality of Moon's pledge to postpone military exercises as a factor contributing to Moon's diplomatic breakthrough. I don't believe that Moon's pledge to postpone military exercises on December 19, 2017 was central to Kim Jong-un's decision to pursue summit diplomacy in 2018. And I have two reasons for this. First, Kim Jong-un had already signaled the possibility of a pause in missile tests following its November 28, 2017 test of the Hwasong-15 rocket, with Kim Jong-un's declaration that, quote unquote, now we have finally realized the great historic cause of completing the state nuclear force, the cause of building a rocket power, end quote. The successful tests enabled Kim to shift from testing to diplomacy from a position of strength. Second, we know that Trump had already signaled openness to possible summitry with Kim Jong-un in a secret message conveyed by UN Political Undersecretary Jeffrey Feltman to North Korean senior officials during a December 2017 visit to Pyongyang. I believe that these developments were as significant to Kim's pursuit of summitry, if not more so, than the postponement of military exercises. These enabling conditions still required South Korea's intermediary role, but it was not easy, and Moon showed great perseverance. Moon's efforts to engineer a meeting between U.S. and North Korean senior officials at both the opening and closing Olympic ceremonies failed. Pence, Vice President Pence, and Kim Yo-jong stood in the VIP box but never met. This necessitated Moon's decision to send a special envoy a week after the end of the Olympic Games. The third time was a charm. I credit Moon's persistence in establishing a needed dialogue link between Trump and Kim, even pursuing a secret inter-Korean summit at Panmunjom in late May of 2018 that helped to put the Singapore summit back together on very short notice. I believe that North Korea deeply understands the purposes and importance of mutual deterrence in the U.S.-North Korea relationship. This understanding is clearly signaled through North Korea's nuclear projects, because the purpose of the project is to establish mutual nuclear deterrence, which the North Koreans clearly regard as a more stable, desirable, and symmetric situation than the decades-long vulnerability that they felt facing a U.S. nuclear threat with no adequate defense option against such a powerful weapon. North Korea might characterize the U.S. policy as hostile and might demand unilateral security concessions from the United States and South Korea, but it has not been clear that they value the concessions they are demanding or are willing to match them with reciprocal self-restraint measures. Instead, they seek to pocket unilateral security concessions that might provide a basis for future exploitation. Still, it is worth continuing to probe possibilities diplomatically by keeping the conversation open. I agree also that the comprehensive military agreement has provided an opportunity to test North Korea's commitment to mutual confidence building and tension reduction measures. But the steps taken have been largely symbolic and were not fully reciprocated by the North. Instead, South Korea's implementation of the CMA has been largely unilateral. The CMA has tangibly lowered tensions and has resulted in a revised U.S.-South Korean military posture toward North Korea, but it has not generated a structural breakthrough. I regard the CMA as an accomplishment for Moon, but one that revealed the fundamental unwillingness of North Korea to embrace peaceful coexistence as an alternative to military deterrence as a source of security on the peninsula. Ultimately, the failure to sustain momentum in inter-Korean relations more than anything else has exposed North Korea's unwillingness to serve as Moon's partner in peace building. Having successfully brought Trump and Kim together in 2018, can Moon reprise his accomplishment as intermediary with Biden in the coming months? I see some significant obstacles, primarily related to fallout that occurred in the gap between the 2018 Pyongyang summit and the failure of the 2019 Hanoi summit. I believe that developments during this critical period, combined with American analytical conclusions about the limits of Kim's credibility resulting from the Hanoi experience, have damaged Moon's capacity and margin to play an intermediary role. In advance of the Hanoi summit, Kim appears to have overestimated Moon's ability to influence Trump, and both Kim and Moon appear to have overestimated Trump's desperation to make a political deal that would have traded U.S.-North Korean détente for partial rather than complete denuclearization. By making complete denuclearization the central objective of his North Korea policy, and by signaling that Kim would have to commit to complete denuclearization as a prerequisite for renewed U.S.-North Korea symmetry, Biden has considerably narrowed the likelihood that Kim Jong-un will return to U.S.-North Korea symmetry, at least within Moon's term. Under these circumstances, I do not believe the Biden administration will be convinced to postpone U.S.-North Korea military exercises, or that a postponement would reopen the door to U.S.-North Korea diplomacy. Instead, I anticipate that the Biden-Kim drama will play itself out after the conclusion of the Moon administration and will be influenced to some degree by the outcome of the next South Korean presidential election. Thank you for the opportunity to join you virtually and to comment on Dr. Kim's presentation.
네, 스콧 스나이더
Thank you very much.
국장님께서는
We have heard from Scott Snyder,
남은 임기 중에
and he has mentioned that
프로세스를
the peace process on the Korean Peninsula has a very low possibility of being resumed during the term of the Moon administration. I think we should continue to discuss this issue through our discussion. We will then go to Senior Research Fellow Lee Soo-hyung of the Institute for National Security Strategy.
예, 소개받은 국감들
As have been introduced, I am Lee Soo-hyung.
김상계 박사님 발표 잘
So thank you very much to Professor Kim Sang-gi for your presentation. Well, in 2017, we thought there could be a possibility of another war on the Korean Peninsula. But in 2018, we started our journey of peace process on the Korean Peninsula, triggered by the Pyeongchang Olympics. We have seen a series of summits between the two Koreas, between the US and DPRK, as well as between the DPRK and China.
지금 생각하고 그 당시 생각하더라도
The position that we have now and the position that we had then was that the core of the peace process is the relations between the US and DPRK.
그런 그 북미 비핵화 프로세스
Well, I believe that the US DPRK peace process has three variants.
비핵화 프로세스가
First,
벌어지는 환경
The environment surrounding the peace process.
또 하나는
Second
북미 비핵화에
is
북한의 접근
the approach by North Korea, the strategic framework in conducting the peace process between the US and DPRK. And third is the time factor. If we take a look at the situational variant, and please refer to page 256 of the proceedings for my discussion, we have to take a look at the environment for the denuclearization, whether it is in 2018 or whether it is now. We can think of two different situations. First is the competition between China and the US. But compared to 3 years ago, currently, the competition is becoming aggravated between the G2, and it will further aggravate in the future. Second, the position of the North Korea participating in the negotiations between the DPRK and the US is that North Korea considers itself a nuclear state, and whether it be the Trump administration or the Biden administration, they are speaking under the prerequisite that the sanctions against North Korea will continue. And that is a situation as the backdrop for the US-DPRK dialogue. And I believe that this situation will not change in the future, but rather the situation has been aggravated compared to 2018, meaning that the strategic competition is becoming more fierce between the US and China, which means that the US-DPRK peace process may be sucked into this competition. And the strategic frame by North Korea to participate in this dialogue is that North Korea would like to go step by step. And the US would like to have a package deal. During the Trump administration, they actually had a stronger stand, but as Dr. Kim has mentioned, the Biden administration is having a coordinated and practical approach, possibly going step by step, but a practical and coordinated approach. We have to think about what this actually means. After the failed Hanoi summit in 2019, Kim Jong-un had asked the U.S. for a new framework, but the current Biden administration's position does not include the new framework requested by Kim. Well, the Biden administration compared to the Trump administration, it seems that their position has improved a bit, but it has not been detailed yet. And so we don't know for sure what their position is at this time. The second is the time factor. When we talk about the denuclearization negotiations during the last 3 decades, the Korean media always talked about whose side is time on. Everybody talks about that. But I always believe that time is always on the side of North Korea.
트럼프 역사의 문제로 사라졌습니다.
Trump is no longer a president.
자, 문재인 정부
Moon Jae-in
지금 1년
administration has a year to go.
그러면 지금 대북
And
제재가
so,
성공을 한다 그러면
If the North Korean
시간은
sanctions would
남의 편이
succeed,
돼야지
then
되는데
time should be on the side of the
다음
US
주
and South
월요일에
Korea.
중동맹
But next
60주년
Monday, North Korea and
북한이 지금
China celebrates the
앞으로
60th anniversary
평양이
of their
부족하고
diplomatic
코로나19
ties.
음식
Currently, North Korea is suffering from COVID-19 and the lack of food. If
방어책이
China
북한의 입장에서는
provides
비핵화
protection
협상에
against these sufferings,
북중동맹 강화로
then they will choose to strengthen their ties with China rather than coming back to the table to talk to the US. And so, the situation of where the strategic competition between China and the US is being aggravated, that makes time on the side of North Korea. We have to wait and see what kind of statement will be made at the 60th anniversary. Of course, there could be no statement, but we need to wait and see. And with fierce competition between China and the US, then the energy that can be invested into denuclearization will not be as large as before because they will need to concentrate on China. And so, I believe that Korea will need to be even more active compared to the 2018 to play the intermediary role, and we have more policy room to do so. The Biden administration talked about a coordinated and practical approach. The content of that approach can be filled by Korea through the dialogue with the US, and I believe that that will leave more room for South Korea to play an intermediary role. We will need to listen to the statement possibly being made next week by China and North Korea, as well as the possible postponement or canceling of the August joint exercises. And if we continue to have a coordinated and practical approach by the US and South Korea, then possibly I believe that by autumn or around the Korean Thanksgiving, or around the time of Korean Independence Day on August 15th, possibly there is room for resumption of dialogue between the two Koreas or dialogue between the US and DPRK. And I believe that that can actually bring back the momentum for dialogue for peace on the Korean Peninsula, depending on the role played by the Moon Jae-in administration. Thank you very much.
Why don't we go on to Professor Shin Seung-ho of SNU?
저는
Yes.
김영준 박사님
Now,
질문에 대한 토론을
my discussion is on Professor Kim Young-jung's presentation. Now, he talked about the core parts of the current administration's military policy in a very concise manner and explained it for everyone to easily understand. I agree with most of the points that he made. Number two, also this was mentioned by President Ko, but the overall theme of this session is peace on the Korean Peninsula. The current administration, when it comes to the strategy for security and diplomacy, if you look at the overall direction, I think that, and you can find this in the overall strategy of Korea for security, that is the pursuit of peace, denuclearization, unification. These are all combined together and discussed. At the national level and at the government level, believe that, of course, it's the best to pursue all three at simultaneously, but in reality it's difficult to pursue the three simultaneously. So I thought about what should be the priority then among the three. So during this administration, I think that the first priority is placed on peace. And I think that that was quite accurate for promoting peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula, because in the beginning of this administration, there was a high risk and tension surrounding a possible war on the Korean Peninsula. But even after that, is it peace or is it unification? We're not saying that we're not going to pursue unification. Of course, the two are both important, but there can be a time gap, because unification is something that has to be pursued in the long-term perspective, and peace is an urgent matter, a pressing matter. And denuclearization is actually a tool to achieve these goals. So I think that this is given relatively lesser priority. And these are the core elements of the strategies for security and diplomacy. There were a lot of challenges concerning these, but this current administration has focused most on peace, and I think that that policy direction was quite appropriate. But despite the promotion of peace and the pursuit of peace, if you look at the past 4 years, and also when we think about the future, there were many challenges, there will be many challenges going forward. So I would like to talk about the dilemma of pursuing peace in the Korean Peninsula. Number one, well, when it comes to peace between the two Koreas, well, engagement and a lot has been pursued, and that is the right way to go. But at the same time, North Korea is still a major security threat for us. For example, there's nuclear weapons and also the asymmetric weapons strengthening, for example, missiles. So we cannot help but to prepare ourselves for that. And as it was mentioned before, we have to continuously work on self-defense through our military capabilities. So on the one hand, we promote peace policies to engage with North Korea, to negotiate, but at the same time, we are strengthening our national defense capabilities. And compared to any other previous administration, this administration has focused more on national defense. I think that this reality is quite contradictory. I'm not saying that this is bad or good. I'm saying it's just the reality, and that it's very contradictory. Number two, the U.S.-Korea alliance. Well, if you look at the status of Korea, the transfer of wartime command, I think that is the right way to go. But at the same time, I also believe that we have to strengthen the U.S.-Korea alliance as part of our security policy. Some people tend to believe that these are at odds, but in fact, coordinating the two were not that easy between Korea and the U.S. In fact, and also, let me go to number 3 first, and then I will ask a question and end my comments. The third contradiction is that the current administration is pursuing a peace process on the Korean Peninsula, and I think that this is a right way to go as well. But if you look at the Korean Peninsula and the surrounding East Asia, you can see that the trends are going in the opposite direction. For example, the competition between U.S. and China, and also the relations between China and Japan also is facing challenges, and also the relation between Korea and Japan. And so, if you look at the peace process in the Korean Peninsula and the surrounding environment of East Asia, how can we coordinate the situation? How can we pursue peace amidst this environment? I think that it is not an easy task to pursue peace on the Korean Peninsula with such conditions in place. And all three elements actually are combined together. So the last question I would like to raise is that we are pursuing peace in terms of our relationship with North Korea. Also, we have the Korea-U.S. joint training, and then we have the OPCON transfer issue. These are all intertwined together. So, for example, if we, as it was mentioned by Dr. Scott Snyder, if we reduce, for example, the OPCON, then maybe that can solve the dilemmas. But actually, in order to transfer the operation command, we have to be able to test our capabilities, and for that, we have to conduct the joint military drills and training with the U.S. So this is indeed a dilemma situation for us. So I would like to ask our speaker about his views on
예,
this.
감사합니다.
Yes, thank you
그
very
세상에
much.
세 가지
So
중요한 딜레마와
Professor
관련한
Shin talked about three elements regarding the dilemma that Korea is faced with, and I think that we would need to further discuss about these important 3 points that he has made. So why don't we listen to all of the discussants speak, and perhaps we can discuss this during the general panel discussion. And next, I would like to invite Dr. Boo Hyung-wook from the Korea Institute for Defense Analysis. Yes, thank you very much. Now, Professor Kim Hyung-jung, as he mentioned during his presentation, for the past 4 years, the Moon Jae-in administration has been making efforts to realize a strong military defense. So there was a lot of efforts made in the military sector. For example, Park Geun-hye administration had a military defense budget of 40 trillion won, but last year, 50 trillion, this year 50.8, and I do believe that next year the budget will rise to 56 trillion. So within this administration, 16 trillion won of a budget increase will be recorded. For the 5 years under the Lee Myung-bak administration, there was an increase of military budget of 8 trillion won. During the Park Geun-hye administration, there was a 6 trillion won military budget increase. So compared to the 2 previous administrations, there was a greater military budget increase and efforts made under this current administration. I'm not sure if you remember this, but Kono Taro, he was the foreign affairs head of cabinet minister of Japan, and he had said that with the September 19th agreement, it seems like the peace process is ongoing. But why is it that South Korea is so focused on expanding its military capabilities? I do not know why South Korea is moving in that direction. And I think that he was sort of implying that this can be a threat for the security of Japan, in my view. But anyhow, we can see that there has been growth and development in the military defense capabilities of South Korea. There has been much growth. For example, not only F-35, but also Global Hawk was introduced. And also there was the Hyunmoo-4 missile, which can accommodate a significant weight of warheads, and some say that it can go up to 4 tons. So there also has been self-developed military technology and weapons, including the fighter jets. So, as you can see, the Moon Jae-in administration has been focusing on, like its motto, developing and advancing our military self-defense capabilities, and much efforts have been put into this. So, allowing the military men to utilize mobile phones almost at the end of the administration. Of course, there was a shock of the meals provided to the soldiers, and also there was a sexual harassment scandal within the military. There were a number of cases that raised concern about the military within the Korean public, among the Korean public, but nevertheless, we cannot deny the fact that there has been considerable achievements made in the military sector and national defense. As it was mentioned by Professor Shin, can this go hand in hand with the pursuit of the peace process? This has been a question that has been asked by many people from the beginning of this administration. Can we strengthen our national defense along with pursuing the peace process? Many people had been contemplating over this issue. There were some people who emphasized peace and said that this leads to a contradiction. We should slow down the buildup of our national defense capabilities. We should actually tone down on our joint military training with the U.S. On the other hand, there are people who are saying that North Korea is not only focusing on traditional weapons, but also it is building up its WMD as well, and therefore we cannot stop building up our national defense capabilities. So there was these two different sides and opinions. I think that the current administration administration has maintained a good position in the middle. It has struck a very good balance. And so I think that this is a two-track policy of South Korea. Now, in 1978, when detente became difficult and there was another rise of tensions during the Cold War era, the Carter administration, which was criticized to be too dovish, implemented a two-track policy. And so what it did was it had deployed the nuclear warhead missiles in Europe, but at the same time it pursued dialogue. And that policy was continued on into the Reagan administration. And from the beginning of the Reagan administration, talks and dialogue continued. And then in 1987, the INF was reached as a result of these ongoing negotiations between the Reagan administration and Gorbachev. And so this led to great achievements. Of course, it took about 3 years for the abolishment of the mid-range nuclear missiles. But anyhow, if you look at the period from 1978 until 1986, until actual progress and outcomes were obtained, there were about 7 to 8 years. Nothing happened during that period. So we see that precedent existing. The Moon Jae-in administration is initiating a two-track policy. I would like to name it that. Well, we have to keep in mind it has only been 4 years since this policy was launched. So I think that it is too early for us to criticize the fact that significant outcome has not come out of this two-track policy. The September 19th agreement was reached, and although North Korea's actions did not directly violate this agreement, but there was the explosion of the liaison office, which kind of hurt the spirit of the agreement. And then in 2021, according to one report, before that, the nuclear warheads was expected to be about 30 to 40, but this year, SIPRI believes that it's about 40 to 50. So, under these circumstances, I think that we are indeed faced with a dilemma, a contradiction, but we have to be patient. We have to have time go by more so that we can truly identify and understand the outcome of this policy, the two-track policy implemented by the Moon Jae-in administration. So we need patience. And we have to have trust in the system because there is a precedent that we can find in the case of US and Soviet Union. And also Dr. Kim Sang-gi and also Professor Kim Young-jun, he mentioned about the possibility of provocation by North Korea, that there exist concerns. Now, I think that from the large context, I think that there is confrontation between the US and China worsening. And so I think that the possibility of a strategic provocation by North Korea the possibility has gone down. SLBM, fire testing, and if there is another testing by North Korea, then I think that there will be a move to deploy strategic assets in Korea by the United States. And so this actually can serve as an asset to keep China in check. So I think that North Korea might feel pressure about this possibility, and so it will restrain itself from committing any further provocations. Dr. Lee Soo-young mentioned that North Korea and China's alliance has strengthened, but this does not automatically mean that this will lead to another provocation by North Korea. For the time being, I think that we should continue with the two-track policy and have patience and try to manage the threats by North Korea. Then there will be one time when we reach a watershed for dialogue with North Korea. And I think that that will be viewed as an achievement of the two-track policy of South Korea. Thank you. Yes, thank you very much. So we have heard from Dr. Poo, and now Professor Jung Jae-kwan of Korea University. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon. I would like to comment on the presentation by Dr. Hong Seok-kun. Dr. Hong talked about the future-oriented perspective. He made great suggestions. Before we go into that, it's been 4 years since the inauguration of the Moon Jae-in administration. And I think we need to have a systematic evaluation of the diplomatic achievements in order to actually execute the future-oriented tasks mentioned by Dr. Hong. So at this point in time, I would like to take a look at some suggestions on evaluating the diplomatic achievements. So I would like to make a total of 4 points. Well, in general, inclusive international cooperation and diversification of international diplomacy. What was the goal of this? We need to clarify the goal. And it's been 4 years since the inauguration of the Moon Jae-in administration. And so what is the legacy that the Moon Jae-in administration wishes to leave in terms of diplomacy and security? So throughout the last 4 years, I believe that in evaluating the last 4 years, we can take a look at these questions. First, in Dr. Hong's presentation, he mentioned that the goal of diplomacy is to achieve sustainable peace process on the Korean Peninsula. If that is the goal, what is the achievement based on this goal for the last 4 years? I think we need to have systematic evaluations. First, let's take a look at the 3 major goals of the peace process on the Korean Peninsula. First is solving the nuclear issue and having permanent peace. Second is sustainable development of the inter-Korean relations. And third is to establish a new economic community on the Korean Peninsula. Compared to these 3 goals, how did the inclusive international cooperation and diversification of international diplomacy contribute to these 3 goals? And I believe that evaluations need to be made systematically and thoroughly based on actual data. Because, first, in order to have sustainable, permanent processes of peace on the Korean Peninsula, even if there are governmental changes, and second, we will continue to see academic discussions on the achievements of the Moon Jae-in administration, and so we need to have systematic evaluations as a basis for such academic dialogue. The second suggestion that I would like to make is that, as Dr. Hong has mentioned, we are striving to have smart power, public diplomacy, and have diplomacy based on our status of being a middle-income country. Given the changes in international order and diversification of diplomatic players, are these concepts aligned with the current trends? I believe so. Having said that, I do have a question. So, diplomacy as a middle-income country, smart power, and public diplomacy, each of these concepts, how can they be brought together in order to achieve the ultimate goal of peace process on the Korean Peninsula? I think we need to make evaluations on that front as well. So in other words, through diplomacy as a middle-income country, how have we contributed to sustainable peace on the Korean Peninsula? How have we contributed to the peace on the Korean Peninsula through smart power? And how have we contributed to peace on the Korean Peninsula through public diplomacy? We need to take a look at these questions to make sure that after the term is over, we can ask the question, what is the grand purpose of diplomacy of the Moon Jae-in administration, and how have each factor of diplomacy contributed to that grand goal? We can evaluate this only when we establish these issues before we go on to the tasks ahead. And we talked about diplomacy as a middle-income country, that we will have a favorable international environment through balanced diplomacy, ultimately contributing to peace on the Korean Peninsula. So this was pointed out by our presenter. Concerning this point, of course, academically and politically, there could be various controversies. And so that is why we need to strictly and thoroughly and systematically evaluate the results. Just like Dr. Lee has mentioned, we will see an aggravation of the relations between China and the U.S. And so even given that situation, is a balanced diplomacy the best choice for South Korea? And if so, how can we execute balanced diplomacy given the situation? We have the new Southern policy and the new Northern policy for balanced diplomacy. And so how have these policies contributed to balanced diplomacy? We need to logically take a look at all of these elements as a basis for future political and academic discussions on the achievements of the Moon Jae-in administration. Last but not least, Dr. Hong also talked about the very trendy concept of triple nexus. Well, I would like to make a suggestion on this front. So triple nexus includes humanitarian aid, development, and peace. So we will be working closely with the international society, including the UN, to establish a sustainable peace process on the Korean Peninsula through the triple nexus. And so, under the Moon Jae-in administration and afterwards, we need to continue the triple nexus approach, is what Dr. Hong has mentioned. But I believe that we need to perfect these approaches. And on that front, I would like to make two suggestions. Triple nexus, how can it be organically integrated with the existing diplomatic approaches of public diplomacy, balanced diplomacy, smart power, and diplomacy as a middle-income nation? And there has always been controversy concerning the triple nexus, and this controversy has always continued ever since the Cold War. Humanitarian aid, development, and peacekeeping is all very important. And we always say that these three goals should go hand in hand. But in reality, sometimes only one goal is advanced, and sometimes two goals are lost in the process. That is the reality. If so, why do we have such a big gap between the goal and the reality? Of course, triple nexus has excellent goals, and maybe because we have ideal goals in one basket, it becomes unrealistic. And logically, we have to take a look at what is the reason and what is the result. What do we need to do first in order to create a virtuous cycle? And so, triple nexus, because we don't know about that logical cycle, we cannot pursue all three goals. And so, what we need to do is to add detail to these ambiguous links. And we also need to take a look at the policy achievements based on a more accurate definition of the triple nexus and how it is related to the diplomatic strategies of the Moon Jae-in administration. And in pursuing the three goals of triple nexus, of course, ultimately, we are doing this for our national interest, but we also need to link this to the international society. And when we join the international society, we always have to contribute. And so what are we going to contribute? Concerning that, we need to consider our policies and principles. And so therefore, we need to take this into consideration. So in a nutshell, during the last 4 years, 정책 성과를 평가할 때 when evaluating the diplomatic achievements of the Moon Jae-in administration, we have to take a look at what we have contributed to the international cooperation and what have we earned through the international cooperation that we have conducted. Thank you very much.
네,
Yes,
다섯 분의
we have just
토론이
heard from the 5
있었는데요.
panel discussants, and we have a little over 10 minutes remaining.
그 프로에 계신 분 중에
If there are anyone from the floor who would like to ask a question or comment, can we hand over the microphone?
네, 저는 정보통신정책연구원의
I am President Kwon Yeol of the Institute of Information and Technology Policy. Thank you very much for inviting me. I have 2 questions. Now, first goes to Dr. Kim Sang-gi. He talked about resolving the North Korean crisis and the peace on the Korean Peninsula. He talked about the past history, and also he mentioned about the considerations for going forward, and he also mentioned 3 important points.
제 질문이 이렇습니다.
My
우리가
question is as follows.
사실 굉장히 이 우리나라가 처한 조건은 여러
If you
나라가
look at the Korean situation, you can see that
전략을 결정해야 될
many countries are
미국과 중국
intertwined together, and based on that, we have to come up with our strategy. For example, amidst the US and China, it's very difficult to come up with our strategy. So having said that,
그야말로 종속 변수가 아니고 독립 변수로서
now,
국방 전략을
as an independent
결정해야 되는
variable for Korea to come up with our military strategy, what is the direction to go? Is it possible to come up with an independent strategy for our military sector? I asked this to Professor Kim. And I have another question for Professor Kim Young-jun. He talked about strengthening the military defense capabilities and also the realization of responsible defense. You made some very important points during your presentation. For example, the transfer of wartime command operations, OPCON, and also Dr. Bu, he mentioned this as well. It was mentioned that the national defense has kept on building its muscle. It has been continuously strengthened over the years. And we can see this through the data, but the general public, I think, it's difficult to actually perceive this. Rather, the unfortunate events or the technology, these remains in the minds of the general public, rather. So I think that for Korea to go forward and enjoy greater prosperity, we will have to have greater defense power, but not only the specific capabilities, but also, I think, mentally, and the morale, that's very important as well. So when there is a crisis situation, are the people, the military men, willing to sacrifice their lives for the nation? Sometimes it seems like we do not have that sentiment in place. So in order to improve this, the mental side, the sentiments, what should be done?
고맙습니다.
Yes,
시간이
thank you very
제한된
much.
관계로
Now, because of the time constraints,
토론에 대한 그 답을 들어야 될 텐데요.
we will now have to hand over the microphone to the speakers to listen to their response. But listening to all of the discussants, I can see that coming up with the new evaluation tool and then perhaps holding another conference like this might be needed, because most of the speakers talked about the achievements of the first 4 years, and then the discussants talked about evaluations and what should be done in the future and a longer term evaluation. So I think that there was a good balance, but many good points came out of the discussion. For example, Dr. Scott Snyder, he talked about how during the remaining term of the administration, it might be difficult to actually continue
the process during the term of the Moon Jae-in administration. But we also talked about how there could be opportunities later on. Professor Shin talked about the 4 dilemmas and how we can solve these dilemmas.
그리고 이제 보영
And
박사님은
Dr. Boo
그렇지만
talked about how
한국형 이중 경로
that the two-track system of the US, of Korea, could be utilized to solve the seemingly contradictory goals, and that it will work out in the end.
지금은 이제 확정성의 논리로
And so
설명할 수 없다는
it's
거죠.
difficult
사회는
to
워낙
confirm at this
복잡하고
point in time because there are complexity within our society.
잘 가고 있는
But
길이 있으니까
there is a
지켜보자.
path even amongst uncertainties, so we will need to wait and see.
정정환 교수님은
Professor Chung,
아까도 말씀드린 것처럼
as I have mentioned before, talked about various issues, and he talked mostly about the connection between different concepts as well as the grand design. So we need to evaluate the current diplomatic achievements based on the grand designs and connections between different concepts. So we have only a little bit of time left, and I think we all need to write a new paper on this topic, but I would like to give 2 minutes each to each of our presenters. First, let's start with Dr. Kim Sang-gi. Well, concerning some points that have been made, I would like to comment. Well, Dr. Scott Snyder has mentioned that in the 2018 peace process, the postponement of the joint exercises did not play as big of a role as mentioned by myself, but I have a completely different opinion. Because the 2018 summit, before the summit, there was the Pyeongchang Olympics, and the Pyeongchang Olympics improved the inter-Korean relations and opened dialogue between the two Koreas. And before that, there was the intention to participate in the Pyeongchang Olympics during the New Year address by Kim Jong-un, and on December 19th of 2017, there was the announcement to postpone the joint military exercises by the US and Korea. If we did not postpone the joint exercises, would North Korea have participated in the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics? Would North Korea actually participate with athletes and supporters at the Pyeongchang Olympics while the joint military exercises are ongoing? I don't believe so. And that is why I believe that the 2018 peace process that happened was triggered by the postponement of the joint military exercises between the US and Korea. And I think it was Dr. Lee who talked about the G2 competition. We need to closely consider this factor. The aggravation of the G2 competition, is it aggravating the US DPRK ties? Well, I mentioned this before in my presentation. I think the leverage for dialogue on the side of North Korea is increasing because of the G2 competition. And I did not have time to mention this, but because of the G2 competition, I think there's a possibility that the US will strengthen their military pressure on China. And sometimes it may be very difficult to distinguish the military pressure on China from the military pressure on North Korea. And so, in order to distinguish the two, what must we do? We need to make sure that we do not become absorbed in the G2 competition. And so that is the direction that we need to move in. And the last point that I would like to add is related to a question that was raised. Of course, the US and China are superpowers, and compared to the two, relatively we have a weaker national power, but we are no longer a small state as we were in the past. Of course, we did show our power on various occasions recently. In terms of military power, in terms of economic power, we are amongst the top 10 in the world. And culturally, we can see that our soft power is very strong. And so our status in the global community has been raised considerably. So we are no longer the Korea of the past. And so we have a very high international status in terms of soft power and hard power. And so we need to make sure that we take this into consideration. Of course, we are surrounded by superpowers, but we need to focus on our national interest in conducting our diplomacy. And when we do so, I believe that we can be very proactive in our diplomacy with great achievements. Yes, we will now go to Professor Kim Young-jun.
We don't have much time, but please go ahead. Yes, I will make this very short.
오늘 두 가지 질문
I received 2 questions. And Professor Shin, I think that everyone understands that there is this dilemma, and you really made a sharp comment about that. The current administration is pursuing a 2-track policy. I think that's a very good way to coin it, Dr. Bu. So the current administration is pursuing a 2-track policy, and I agree with what you mentioned about the 3 dilemmas. For example, we are pursuing national defense strengthening along with the peace process, and also there is also the Korean peace process, but at the same time there is the uncertainties in East Asia. And I think that we have to pursue peace, but also we have to understand the current situation of the G2 being at odds. And I agree with what was mentioned by Dr. Bu. The question raised by Dr. Shin was about the joint training. In order to pursue peace, you have to reduce or stop the training, but at the same time, we need the training to verify the capabilities for the OPCON transfer. Yes, that is true. Now, when it comes to the OPCON transfer, well, I have had the opportunity to talk in private settings with Gallucci and other previous officials. And looking at the OPCON transfer issue, I think that, first of all, as a big deal, would the transfer of OPCON help as a big deal? And there are 140 conditions, but actually that's just an excuse. The U.S. and Korea has a very close relationship, and so just like we concluded the military guidelines, if we have strong trust, then I think that the OPCON transfer, and if there is OPCON transfer, if it's believed to be beneficial for the U.S. in terms of many factors, including its confrontation with China, then I think that we would be able to push forward. So rather than the joint training being important for OPCON transfer, I think that what we have to focus on is actually strengthening the communication with the United States. And I know that Professor Shin, you are very active in terms of your engagement with those in the United States, but these types of communication and open discussions are very important with our partners in the U.S. So when we talk about OPCON transfer, we only exchange our views, and there are not many academics from the United States being involved in these discussions over OPCON transfer. So I think that in the future, we have to have them more involved so that we can talk about this issue. For example, we can have the scholars from the Brooks Institute, for example, to be involved in these discussions and deliver the message and find ways to show that this can be beneficial for the U.S. as well. And also, I received another question about emphasizing only hard power might not be enough. We have to strengthen the mentality and the morale. And like you said, yes, there is a lot of interest among the people in these matters. Now, we have to think about the MZ generation. The military men, they are young, and they are different from our time. When we were serving our military duty, we thought that the enemy was indeed North Korea, and they were the evil that we had to topple. But with the conclusion of the missile guidelines, we can deliver the message that we are strengthening our self-defense. And I think that there are young people who are showing enthusiasm when they see these types of news. So I think that when it comes to strengthening the mentality and the morale, well, I think we have to understand the MC generation. Well, there are many military-related issues concerning the MC generation, and they have a different sentiment. They've grown up in an environment that is different from ours. So rather than providing the same education to them about North Korea, defining North Korea as an evil, I think that we have to adopt a different approach. For example, not only North Korea, but there can be many other potential challenges that we face, and there could be many other potential enemies as well. And so revising the missile guidelines, if that's shown in the news, a lot of people click on the news and read the news, and I think that most of the readers, a lot of them are young people, so they are interested in these matters. Last but not least, Dr. Hong?
Yes, I think think we are out of time already, so I will keep it short. Thank you very much for those sharp comments. Well, I believe that talking about ad hoc aid and development and peacekeeping, if these issues are in silos, then it will not be leading to great achievements. And that's why we're talking about the triple nexus. And we wanted to talk about humanitarian aid, peace building, and peacekeeping with development. And we try to include all of those issues in a paper that we wrote recently. And we took a look at cases of virtuous cycles, of cases where such elements were irrelevant. And so we're in the process of writing this paper. And as the two of you have pointed out, we are a diplomatic country, and so we need to include the MZ generation and the general public in our discussions. And so we need dialogue and discovery of agenda items. And so, Professor Chung, I do want to answer your questions, but due to the time constraint, I will not be able to answer your questions at this point in time, but I would like to mention that we're continuing research on this front.
So I think that perhaps you can write new papers to respond to the questions and comments that were raised today during the session. With this, I would like to close session 4 because we are out of time. And also there is a roundtable discussion following session 4. And during that session, there will be a briefing of what was discussed during the different sessions. With this, I would like to conclude session 4. Thank you everyone for your participation. Thank you. Yes, thank you very much. Once again, I would like to thank President Go Yuan of Korea Institute for National Unification, the 3 speakers, and the panel discussants for your contribution. Yes, this concludes Inclusive Korea 2021 session 4, as well as all of the 4 sessions prepared. After a short break starting from 3:20, we will begin the Inclusive Korea 2021, the Moon Jae-in administration 4-year journey, inclusive recovery, and a leap forward. Roundtable discussion will begin. I will meet you after the break. Thank you.